Over the last 5 decades, there has been this substantial increase in the use of exclusionary discipline, with the rate of suspensions more than doubling for Black and Latinx children. And research has shown that being in a stricter school can lead to negative long-term consequences, such as decreased educational attainment or increased likelihood of engagement with the criminal legal system.
This is the whole school to prison pipeline thing, right? That if we suspend people, if we use these kinds of exclusionary practices, folks are more likely to have interactions with law enforcement. And folks who have more interactions with law enforcement are more likely to get arrested, right? And so you continue down the pipeline.
Restorative practices provide an alternative to educators that is not harmful for students, and at the same time can address behavioral issues and improve school culture.
It allows us to truly teach new behaviors, which I think is sorely lacking.
Personally, I experienced the school to prison pipeline. I was suspended from the high school I was attending for graffiti, which then put me back out there in the streets writing on walls. And I ended up spending 10 days at the Juvenile Temporary Detention Center. And at the end of the day, the graffiti was still out there. There was no repairing, there was no preventing, just lots of harm and punishment happening.
Restorative practices might lead to them having a sit-down conversation with the custodian who can explain to them, what the implications of that act were, right? How it made their job harder, how it made them feel, and a logical consequence would be that student then being asked to work with the custodian to repair that harm.
So the main question the study is trying to address is, what's the impact of restorative practices as implemented in schools on students' behavior, their school culture, and the everyday experience of students in schools, and student outcomes.
And so this is in particular exposure to suspensions, both in and out of school, attendance, exposure to the criminal legal system through arrest records from the Chicago Police Department, self-reported school climate, so how students perceive their school environment in terms of safety and sense of belonging, and then finally academic performance as measured by GPA and student test scores.
Following restorative practices, we see decreases in suspensions without any evidence of increased classroom disruption. The days that students are now in school are actually better days. They feel that they are more likely to belong, they feel safer in school, they feel that their classmates' behavior has improved. We see reductions in arrests for both violent and nonviolent offenses inside and outside of school.
We identify an 18% decline in out-of-school suspension days in response to the introduction of restorative practices and a 19% decline in student arrests. And we believe these are particularly important results given the negative long-term consequences associated with student exposure to punitive discipline, as well as involvement in the criminal legal system.
Schools themselves act as the socializing institution, right? They don't just teach us reading, writing, and arithmetic. They also teach us how to behave. And so students themselves are now learning to resolve conflicts in a more reparative or restorative way, which then actually makes them less likely to get into conflict in the first place.
Those students are going to become much better members of society because they can handle conflict, they understand what it means to repair harm, and allows us to see behavior issues as a learning opportunity. We're holding them accountable in a way that also pulls them back in.
We don't view restorative practices as panacea, and so as we continue conducting research, experimenting, trying to understand, the full set of tools that are available, right now restorative practices does seem like it holds substantial promise in terms of providing one alternative to what's been the status quo, which we know has imparted harm on generations of students.
The research findings speak for themselves, but beyond just the data, beyond what we see in the numbers, I've seen the impact of restorative practices firsthand and how it actually changes people's lives. I have seen people repair harm and conflicts between one another that they never thought was possible. I have engaged with school leaders to process the impact of COVID-19, to provide them a space to receive support and just to feel like somebody's listening. Engaging in that way allows our school leaders who are struggling with so many challenges to put one foot in front of the other and wake up another day and support our kids. So it's not just about reducing suspension, it's about building lives, it's about building new connections to support our kids as we're trying to raise them together and get them to where they want to be in their lives.